Go ahead and start recording. I have a question for Face the Reaper. Go ahead, Andy. Head it in there. So we have started recording the meeting. So just let everybody know that we're running this on Skype. I am recording this. This is Matthew Buza. And I'll be running everything here locally, the slides and everything. And then Susan will be giving the presentation via a distance. This is social distancing 101 right here. And we will go ahead and let's see, Andy, I have changes already headed in. Okay, yeah, Andy, go ahead and just send your edits to Tony, and then we can get those updated onto up onto the webpage as well. And then so this talk will be recorded and then put onto our YouTube page and then sent out to all the attendees so they can watch it on their own time as a follow-up, and we'll see how much we want to make this public. We'll make it a private page for the time being, a private listing on YouTube, so only the link will work. So you can't really search for it, but we'll see if we want to make those type of things public eventually. So we'll see how bad we crash and burn here today. That's where we are right now. We do have a couple rules of order. We do want to welcome you to the Writers Co-op online meeting. We're sorry that we have to do this, but to keep it going and to keep interest in the group and to keep everybody moving forward while we have a lot of free time. And it looks like we may have even more. And I will nose. There we go. Good job. Thank you, Arena. I'm going to mute you. Thank you. So while we have a lot more time coming up, we want to get you guys to continue to write, continue to develop yourselves as authors. We want to be able to have these meetings, and we're going to keep them on the regular cadence. The meeting will be a little bit shorter than it normally is because it's just going to be focused on the talk and a couple of minor items. We do ask you guys to mute yourselves at all times. All questions will go into the chat window. Let's try to keep the chat to a minimum once the meeting is going, and I will forward all the comments to Susan. I'll be on mute myself, and then I'll just chime in with a question to her so she can answer that. Again, don't share your webcam. I know it's kind of hard to do that on startup, but thank you. Also wash your hands, and I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Susan, do you have anything you need before you start other than the slides?
Just the slides.
Just the slides. Got it.
At least in theory.
In theory. Okay. Can you see my screens? You can see your slides now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we are recording. Everything is running, and go ahead, introduce yourself and have at it, and I'll be on mute.
Okay. I'm Susan Brown, and I'm going to do a talk about editing, which is today it's divided into two parts. Today we're just going to do overview, big picture, and the next session that we do will be the more specific ways to go about editing and how to fix things, how to find things, that kind of thing. Ahead of time, I have to apologize. I have never done an online presentation before. I'm used to facing people, so you can't see my hand gestures. I apologize for that because they truly make the presentation. Feel free to ask questions, and Matthew will relay them to me, and I will answer them as best I can. Before we even start, I am a huge proponent of editing. At one point, I worked as an editor for Scholastic, as well as editing my own work forever. And I think that one of the problems with a lot of indie writers is they don't even know how to start editing. And they don't have access to a professional editor. And a professional editor is fabulous. But if you don't have one, you don't have one. So these are ways that you can edit your own work in a professional way. Okay, keep going. Slide master. There we go. So this is, as I said, this is the big picture. This is you hunkered over with your great idea, hoping for the best. Next picture. Next. Okay, so the reason that we're doing this is probably obvious. You need to edit because people aren't smart enough to get a whole huge idea into a few thousand completely clear, perfectly crafted sentences and paragraphs. A lot of people feel that because they wrote it, it's good. And that's really not true. Most of us just aren't smart enough. I've known of one or two picture book editors or writers who were able to do that, where they could write it and pretty much had it good. But the thing is that what they did was they thought it all out ahead of time, and it was short enough that they could remember it all. So they didn't have to do the revision. But if you're doing a book length book, or if you're not experienced in your genre, it's a hugely important thing. And when we start, we have this amazing, brilliant idea in our heads. And what we want more than anything is to get it onto the page in that same brilliant way, which it never is. And then if you have put it together properly, the person who reads it will have that same idea, that same landscape, that same revelation in their head. And that's where we want to go. Okay, next slide. This is what we're aiming for. Books, readers, the people completely absorbed in the worlds you've created. Okay, next one. Okay, so there's two stages in editing. The first stage is developmental editing. You pretty much do that one on your own. You may have some assistance with it with ARC readers or readers that you trust, but you're doing a lot of this yourself. It involves revision. It's looking at the entire document, and it's intense and it's difficult because you aren't just looking at a sentence or a paragraph. You're looking at the way the entire story gets together. All the pacing, the tone, every piece of it to make sure that it's structured in a way that people can understand it and absorb it. And then the second stage is the copy editing, which is essentially tidy up. You're looking at spelling, punctuation, word errors, repetitions, things like that. That's an area where you try to do. That's actually the area where you have the most problem with a lot of things because you don't see it because you know the story so well. But that's something that people can usually get help with from somebody else. Okay, next picture. Okay, getting started. The main idea is that you edit the big stuff first. You're looking at an inverted pyramid where the big one is at the top and you go down, down, down to the tiny piece. It's very important to work in manageable bits, however you structure that, because your mind can't manage enough. So you're looking for just a handful of errors every pass through, which is one of the reasons why it takes a while. Okay, next one. Okay, what you have to plan on, first of all, is time. Editing, for me anyways, takes at least, if not more time than writing the first draft because there's so many areas to it and there's so much detail. The other thing, if you possibly can, is distance from your work. Let days, preferably weeks, pass between completing your first draft and doing your revision. For example, I just finished a manuscript which I thought was done, perfect, fabulous, ready to go. My daughter is doing some editing for me, and I haven't worked on it for like 5 weeks, and I realized suddenly my ending is wrong. I've got a big mistake in the ending. I have it's a kid's book, so I have the bad guy grab the heroine, and he flashes the knife at her. And I suddenly realized, where did this knife come from? I haven't got any foreshadowing of it. There's been no mention of a knife before. And it was an easy thing to do when I was writing it, and it seemed to make sense. But when I had time to look at the entire book and the way the book is structured, didn't work. So I will have to revise the ending. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had just kept going from, I finished the book, now I'm going to go back and go through it. If you are able to work on more than one project at a time, it's very helpful because you can put one aside, work on the other, and then come back to the first. But that's, personal style and what you're able to do. Okay, next one. Okay. So what we're looking at is story structure. Our society thinks in threes. Now, I want to emphasize that it's our society, not every society. Most stories follow roughly a 3-act structure. Next one. Okay, so we're looking, first of all, I want to look at plot development. When you're doing a book, you want a very clean line of action. I'm sure you've all read stories where the action sort of wobbles around the main plot because the writer kind of went off in one direction, then they went off in another direction. You see that sometimes in mysteries where the writer was trying to create a red herring but didn't really work it into the story properly. And then you're not entirely sure why each piece is where it is. So you want that clean line of action. If you have subplots, even if the action and the characters are different, they need to thematically mimic the main plot. They need to provide a counterbalance. Like, is it the opposite of what's happening? Is it the same but in a different situation? But you don't want it to be going wildly off in a different direction because that will make your action line wobble. So the other piece of advice that I got a long time ago with writing is if you can take it out without affecting the story, take it out. You don't want words you don't need. Okay, next one.
Susan, I had a quick question. How much does writing craft, is that sort of like a tool in your tool belt that's needed for editing? Like, can you be an effective editor if you don't have much knowledge about storycraft? Maybe talk a little bit about that. I don't know.
Yes and no. Presumably, if you've come to writing, you're a reader and you've probably read several hundred books. And so without being consciously aware of it, you've been building a knowledge of how things should go. And when you're not really familiar with the craft itself, there's a tendency to go by the feel, like this doesn't feel right. And if you do research into it, then you will find out the reason it doesn't feel right is because there's a structural error. Or not error, more of a misstep. Do I have an example of parallels? I need to think of that. If you were looking at, so I don't know if that explains what I'm trying to say. I think as a writer, you're always trying to build your awareness of it. One of the things I did was I went back and got a master's in English and creative writing, thinking that it would improve my writing. It destroyed my writing. I couldn't write anything worth anything for like 4 years because it was so intellectualized. But after that, I went back and I started looking. Articles from other writers are really helpful. There's a whole bunch on YouTube. There's a really nice piece that Neil Gaiman has done or about, he's got a master class, and just his introduction, it's a 2-minute introduction, has got a lot of information in it. So you can go on YouTube if you want the writers to actually talk to you. There are many, 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 many articles about specific aspects of craft. And you just keep reading them and you just keep going to it. And that's kind of the way you work on it. Now, Joel was asking about an example of subplot mimicking plot. And I know there are some. Shakespeare's a good example. I'm trying to think of them offhand. Where you would have, say, in whatever play in Shakespeare, you would have the main action, and there's often a comedic secondary characters who are doing something similar. Like if the main character is falling in love and doubting whether the other person loves them, then they might flip it that his best friend is in love but is totally confident, but her person is not doing it. I don't know if that makes sense. I would have to come up with more specific examples, which I'm not doing well off the top of my head. So if we can table that one, I'll see if I can find something for next time. Okay. Next. What? Next one?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Did you want to say something or?
No. I'm sorry. I chimed in. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I have here is a 3-act structure diagram. There's lots of them around. The ones you saw in literature with ascending and descending action, that's very helpful if you're a reader. It is not helpful if you're a writer because the pacing for it is off. It's too abrupt. This one, I think, is loosely based on Sid Field's. I've got other ones that show other things. Sid Field wrote a book called Screenplay, and It's probably the best book I've ever read that takes apart the step-by-step of putting together a plot. So in this very basic 3-act structure, in Act 1 is the setup. And you have your beginning, your introduction, then you have they call it here an inciting incident, meaning that the world acts on the character reacts to it. They go into Act 2 where there's problem, 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 problem. In the middle, there's often a twist, and then more problems, problems. Everything gets terrible. There's a crisis. Good guy meets the bad guy. Problem is faced, whatever it is. And then there is the descending action, which is after the climax, which is action, you get resolution, which is the emotional wrap up. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in Act 1, you're presenting the characters, the location, and the problem. Then life intervenes so the character can't avoid the problem because they often want to. The character reacts. This is a piece where a lot of people don't put it in. They put in the character goes, oh no, oh no, oh no, and then they immediately go into action. But that'll give the reader the feeling that they can't catch their breath because it's too fast. So you need the action, the reflection. What will I do now? This is where, and a lot of times in mysteries, they'll go eat something and then get a clue or something. I don't know. Whatever it is, whatever trope it is in the genre that you're writing in, but you get all the action, then you get the reaction. One of the problems with genre fiction is that the tropes can make the setup overly predictable. So a good writer using a similar setup is able to make it feel fresh, often through character development, often through a difference in the problem, presentation, whatever. I was reading I think it was a sword and sorcery thing. It had all these great reviews, so I got a sample and I read it. And just in the sample, after about 10 pages, I was ready to throw my Kindle because everything was a trope. The character did this. The evil people were this. She had this response. She did this. She did that. And I mean, it was like I knew it before I'd read it because there was nothing fresh about it. And the freshness, again, comes in your own vision, in your own sense of story, and in the picture that you see because you're transcribing the screenplay in your head. Okay, next one. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is just the beginning piece, the first act, which typically takes a quarter to a third of your book. You don't want to rush it. So you start with your beginning. You have to present the character. You start developing the character. You have the setting. You have the problem revealed. Sometimes it's a flash problem. Sometimes it slowly develops. The world acts on the character. This is really important because often the character will try to avoid taking action or will try to remain in the status quo, sort of like when there's coronavirus and everybody thinks, well, this isn't really going to happen to me and I'm just going to go out anyways, and then their best friend gets it. Then they have to react, reevaluate, decide what they're going to do. Okay, next slide. That takes them into Act 2. And in Act 2, the character realizes they have to face whatever the problem is. Everything goes wrong. There is constant reaction, and the reaction is the place where you can show the character growth, because in a good book, there is always character growth. In a poor book, the character at the end is the same as the character at the beginning. It's like reading a comic book about Superman who never changes. So you want that growth to happen, and it has to happen consistently through the story, not just sort of, and now a sadder but wiser man. When you get to the midpoint, there is often a twist, not necessarily if your action is consistent, but there often is in a well-plotted book. And more goes wrong, character figures out how to solve the problem. That's kind of important because all along they probably have the failed plans. They're like, we're going to do this, and it doesn't work. And we're going to do this, and it doesn't work. And then they get to a certain point, which is toward the end of, it's like 2/3 of the way through your book, and the character has actually figured out how to solve the problem. The danger is at its worst. Like, there is a lot of danger. It's not like, oh, we got it now, let's go, grab a beer and go home. It's consistently more difficult. The popular wisdom for structuring a book is you chase the person up the tree, you throw rocks at them, and then you let them figure out how to get down. This is the part where they're figuring out how to get down after you've thrown a lot of rocks at them. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the piece of the diagram that shows that, where it's called the ascending action, particularly if you're looking at it from a literary standpoint. And after each, in a short story, there's typically one obstacle. In a picture book, or a picture book, actually, you would try to have 3 obstacles. And after each one, the character reacts, and this is your opportunity to show growth. And change and thinking. So the character's acting, the danger is getting worse. The twist in the middle helps avoid the mid-story sag, and problems keep increasing, the plans fail, the character realizes how to solve the problem. So that's what's happened in the first 2/3 of your book. Okay, next one. Okay, so here's just a redo of it. Problems are at their worst. The character faces the evil, the antagonist, or whatever the problem is. This is the face up where they come face to face with it. And they have to act, and there is great danger to the character. Otherwise, when I was writing at one point, I was working with a story editor. We did a TV show. And the guy questioned why we had the characters doing something, and like, oh, because they really care. And he said, no, they have to have something they will lose, or else it's just bloody mindedness on their part. And so that's part of the thing, is your character has to have something they will lose when they face up against whatever the problem is. They're the dreadful or else. So that's been building all along. Now, when you're solving when you come to your climax, when you're solving the plot, if you have subplots, you solve the subplots in reverse order. The third, or the least important, goes first, the second most important goes second, and then the most important is last solved. So the climax, the action of the plot, is solved. The good guys have won or lost or done whatever. The resolution is the emotional needs are wrapped up. So first you wrap up the action, and then you wrap up the emotions. That's where you get the sadder but wiser man. They all lived happily ever after. Finally, they understood the importance of friendship. Whatever it is you're going to do, that's where that happens. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just the summary of it, showing it in the diagram. So you'll notice that this part is shorter, because I don't know if any of you have ever read a book where you get to the problem is solved, and they keep going on and on and on and on, and you're like, what, is there something else happening that I missed? So you're looking for the emotional revolution, and you have to do it fairly quickly. You need a couple of pages tops for the emotional resolution, because you should have been building towards it all the time anyways. Okay, next one. Okay, so if your plot is uneven, like if you don't have it structured in a proper way, you're going to get a mid-book sag. Your beginning, I wrote these because this is what my problem is. I do this all the time. My beginning is too extended. You could also have your beginning too short, where you get into the problem too fast and the reader's going, what? Who is this person? Why do I care? Your ending can be too quick. That's another thing that I do. It's sort of like, okay, I'm done with this book. Let's wrap it up. It can be too quick. It can be too long. But if you're uneven, you will get these feelings of being off balance. And you can, like I said, get a resolution that's so slow your reader wonders why the book is still going. Too fast. I don't understand. What do you mean? Can you put it in the thing about too fast? What you're asking me? Am I talking too fast, or am I not explaining what a book going too fast is?
Christine, if you wanted to unmute and ask Susan a direct question, go ahead.
Are you there? It hasn't unmuted, so.
Yeah, she's just typing.
Okay.
No thanks.
Chicken.
That's effective social distancing. All right, so maybe
Yes.
we'll just slow down just a tad.
You mean I'm talking too fast, or going through the information too quickly? I can slow down.
Just as a reminder, we are also recording this, so you, Christine, you'll be able to rewatch this on YouTube anytime you want.
Right. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a good example of how the structure works is with fairy tales. And I like using the Billy Goat's Gruff. You can use the picture book of the very hungry caterpillar. But for this one, I just did the Three Little Pigs. So once upon a time, which is the setting, there were three little pigs, which are your characters, who decided to go out into the world to seek their fortunes. That is the action with a potential problem. So that's like foreshadowing. The first little pig was a lazy little pig and decided to build his house of straw. So you have character development and foreshadowing, because we know that a house of straw is not a good choice. Along came the big bad wolf, who huffed and puffed and blew the house down. So that is the outside problem. The big bad wolf has come from the outside. The pig didn't invite him in. He's just there. So the little pig escaped and ran to his brother, the second little pig. So that was his reaction. He was like, oh no, and off he went. So that's how Act 1 would work. Act 2, the second little pig was only a little bit less lazy than his brother, and had built his house of sticks. So we have character development and we have foreshadowing. And you know the song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, a Big Bad Wolf, that can bring in hubris and all these other things. So the wolf, who was hungrier than ever, followed the first little pig. The danger is increasing. He huffed and puffed and blew the house down. The danger increases further because the little pig's sitting there amid all the sticks. So the pigs barely escaped to their brother's home, who promised they would be safe. So that's reaction, character development, and the potential for the problem to be solved. So in Act 3, okay, the third little pig was a hardworking little pig and had built his house of bricks. So we have character development and foreshadowing of the solution. The desperately hungry wolf followed the pigs to their brother's house. The danger has increased. He huffed and puffed, nothing. And angrier than ever, the wolf climbed onto the roof. The danger is at the maximum. When the pig heard the wolf, he lit the fire. That's the solution to his problem. The wolf leapt down the chimney and was burnt to a crisp. But the antagonist is faced, and that is the climax of the action. The little pigs danced and sang and lived happily ever after, which is the resolution. So that's how that would work in a fairy tale. Okay, next one. Okay, tips to get you going, because me just talking about this is of no help whatsoever if you don't know what to do about it. Okay, first of all, does your story follow the 3-act structure? It's important that it does. If you live in a different culture, you might, my clock is chiming, I thought I turned it off. If you live in a different culture, you might have a different structure you're working with. Like a lot of cultures will have a 4-act structure. They'll do circular stories. But in our culture, the typical book is 3 acts. And in a standard length book, each main event, like story plot point, is going to fall within about 10 pages if you actually plot your book out. If the events don't fall predictably, you're going to have a pacing problem. And a reader won't identify it. What they'll do is just think the story doesn't feel right. And this is where your skill comes in, because you need to know where to fix it and how to make that feel right for them. A short story has a much tighter structure and typically doesn't do 3 acts. It will have like one initiating scene. Okay, next one. Okay, so to practice, to do this, if you're finding looking at your manuscript this way seems impossible because it's so big, try it with a fairy tale. And as I said, if it's from the Western tradition, it will fall into this structure of 1, 2, 3, beginning, middle, and end. Small, medium, large. I mean, we think in threes. You could, and once you've done it with a fairy tale, you could try it with a book that you're very familiar with, like a good quality book. Oh, it says in a series of books, how do you handle it? I'll get to that in a second. And then one of the things I would recommend is you outline your book, noting only the significant scenes and the chapter and page numbers where they fall. A lot of people outline at the beginning, which I think is probably a really good practice. I don't. I tend to have kind of an idea and I start writing. But I do stop and outline like midway or 2/3 of the way and then at the end. And it isn't an outline so much like, this will happen, then this will happen. Because then I'm looking at what I actually did have happen. And if everything's all squished together, I'm moving it too fast. If it's way far apart, that means that midsection is going to get really boring. And I need to tighten it up, because you have to have a consistent pace to keep people interested. Okay, the next one. Okay, now other structures you can use. You can do a timeline chart. That's really good for picture books. And it's very clear, but it's harder in a longer work because you're usually spread over a longer time. Because, I mean, if your time span in your book is a day or two, then you end up doing it like 12 minutes, 14 minutes. Character growth is another really good one to do if you feel you have problems in developing your character. So you can record the character development in significant scenes showing or foreshadowing the character, like you plot it out just exactly the same way and in a chart. And if you see that the growth is steady, you're good to go. If your growth is not steady, like if you've got great big pieces where there's just action and there's no change in character, you could lose your readers, not if they're plot directed, but if they're people who like character and feel like they want to take part in the story, they need that steady growth of character. I would.
Susan, we had a question from the chat regarding from Joseph, potentially a plotter versus pantser question. Do you have any input on that? You're talking a lot about plotting. I know some people in here that are pantsers. Is there any difference there that maybe you could help them with?
Yeah. If you're a plotter, you'll probably get all this done ahead of time. If you're a pantser, you'll just write. And then you'll get to the end and say, damn, I've got a book. It's awesome. And that's where you need to step back from it and see if what you wrote actually fell into a structure. Because if it didn't fall into a structure, you've got to fix it. And it's not like there's a right way or a wrong way. Different people create differently. It's a first draft is rarely awesome. I mean, you may think it is, but it really isn't usually. It's the revision and the pacing and making sure everything falls where it ought to fall is what makes the book really good. And I think I'm basically saying you have to have your book plotted out well, and whether you do it before or you do it after doesn't really matter, because that's your style, and everybody has a style that works for them. But I mean, my writing partner, Anne, she would write a 30-page outline for a kid's book. I would write a half a dozen sentences on a napkin. But whereas she didn't need to do as much afterwards in terms of making sure the plot went straight, I had to do a lot more. And it's like you put the time in, whether you put it in at the front or you put it in at the end, you still have to put it in. And you just do whatever works for you, whatever you think is most comfortable in the way you create and the way you hone it and fine tune it and make it accessible to other people. If you're only writing for yourself, you can do any damn thing you want and it's just fine. But if you're writing for other people, you have to give it to them in a format that they can absorb. You don't want them to be jarred out of what they're reading because it doesn't work right and they're not quite sure why. I worked with a writer one time. He was an amazing writer, and he used to refer to it as the fictive dream. And anything that awakens somebody from that fictive dream is a problem. It can be a typo, it can be pacing that's wrong, it can be some character action that doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter. And in the revision process, what you're doing is making sure that that fictive dream is uninterrupted, that it just flows. It's like a river. It's very zen, whatever you need it to be. But it's a lot of work that way. That's why for me, revision takes longer than writing, because my ideas in my head when I start are amazing and I whip them down and they look great and I'm so happy, and then I read them and I see that gremlins have destroyed it all, and then I have to go back in and do the slog work of making it right. So anyways, that is my opinion. You may not agree. However, what I do believe is don't do all of these because you're going to make yourself crazy. You'll never get the book finished otherwise. Okay, next one. Questions. So if you've got questions, type them out for Matthew and he'll relay them to me.
Thank you very much, Susan, for giving the talk. Let's see if any questions come in.
Somebody asked, I wasn't sure who, but somebody asked about a series.
Yeah. How would you go about handling a series, Susan? You've done this a couple times already.
What I would do is, you're looking at a story arc. You almost can think about it like episodic TV or about, the movies that have a continued story. You have a large arc of your overall story, of where it's going. And then you have smaller arcs within it. Within those smaller arcs, you have to have a complete book that does all of these things. And then the next book does it, and the next book does it, and the next book does it. And, but you can also, if you're like I know a couple of the people have done a long series, and they don't just write a book and release it and write a book and release it. They plot out the whole series. And so each book is unto itself, so to speak, but each book also feeds into the larger arc. So you're looking at far more complex pacing. Writing a really good series, unless you're just doing, a secondary character who comes to the fore, is really difficult. And I have nothing but admiration for people who write these, 5-book series.
Susan, you're talking about something like this, maybe just as in the image, you have some meta story arc, and then you have like book 1, book 2, and book 3. Is that kind of what you were describing?
That's exactly what I was describing. Okay.
And then so there's like defined points here and here and here that are critical to character development and whatnot.
Yeah, and you would also, you can't see my hand pointing, but also in the small bumps, you would have that same structure that you would have for the whole thing. You would have it inside. So it's almost like you're building Russian nesting dolls or something like that.
Yeah, almost like you have three acts here, 3 acts here, and then 3 acts here, and then you also have 3 acts as well. Okay, cool. And I drew your hand. It's almost to scale.
Oh, I like it. It's good. It works perfectly.
All right, great. So let's see, Joel. Let's see. There's a couple questions. Oof, got some questions coming in.
You were all presupposing I have answers.
So Linda's making a comment between standalone series and episodic stories. Actually, Linda, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, I know you have a lot to say about series. You do a lot of them. Is there anything you'd like to add to this as well? She's trying to find the mute button. Linda? Yep.
There's a little microphone somewhere. That's all I know.
Yeah, I think she's unmuted, but maybe her microphone's not set right now.
Okay. Yeah,
yeah, when she chimes in, we can let her talk. She's got a lot of experience in this as well. Go ahead, Susan. Sorry.
Yeah, you can have one of the things that happens, like Tony just said, that she thought she was only going to do one, but then it kept going.
Yeah, right.
But she's built her character arcs and she's built her story arcs, even though the overall her story arc got bigger, and each book was a story unto itself. Really.
Okay. So Joseph was asking for any type of books or materials that you found useful, anything beyond like Stephen King's On Writing, any other great editing books or books that on Storycraft that can assist that maybe you can recommend.
Well, there's, like I said, Sid Field's screenplay is really good for getting basic story structure. There's a story doctor, a script doctor. I think her name is Linda Seeger. Okay. And she wrote an amazing book about developing character. Okay. And that's a really good book. It's written supposedly for screenwriters, but it's perfectly applicable to fiction writers. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. There's other books I really like about writing, like Writing Down the Bones.
Mm-hmm. What's the cat book that a lot of people have recommended in the past? It's the TV show one, or it's a storytelling. Maybe it's a screenplay one.
Which one is that?
I can't remember. There's something about a cat. My recommendation is the Story Grid. There's a podcast, a book, and a website that's devoted to it. That one's helped me out a lot. I tend to be kind of in between a pantser and a plotter, so I recommend the Story Grid.
Oh, there it is. Tori just put it. Save the cat, right?
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. Thank you, Tori. Save the cat.
I'll take a look at it.
And Linda's recommended Writing in the Dark by Dean Wesley Smith. Mm-hmm. Another good one here as well.
Yeah, those are great.
Any other questions anybody might have?
Anything else people need to know?
Yeah, we came in right at a good time too. So.
Oh yeah, the master class. Somebody mentioned that the master class that has writers. Mm-hmm. I was looking at the one that Neil Gaiman talked about. His introduction, his 2-minute introduction, had so much more information in it than a lot of people have.
Yeah, I linked. I think the trailer to it. So if anybody it goes up in the chat, there's a link to it as well.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I was actually thinking of linking it into this presentation, but it kind of goes in different directions too. So I didn't.
I think Soderbergh has a class as well. That's really good.
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen Judy Blume's master class.
Ooh, I haven't either.
Good. Another one that I absolutely love is Elizabeth Gilbert, the one who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, on the TED Talks. She's got a TED Talk about writing. And I think it is the best thing I have ever seen about the reality of being a writer.
Okay.
And she just talks, like, she has this great part where she talks about how it feels that everybody says to her, do you worry that the best thing you've ever done is already behind you? And then she talks about the idea of a muse and genius and all these things.
Yep, I just linked it. I just linked it into the chat if anybody wants that as well.
Okay, that is my absolute favorite TED Talk about writing. I think that's all I have. I think you've drained me dry. Next time we do this, we're going to talk more about developmental editing and about copy editing and the pitfalls of them and tips on how to do it. Because if you don't know how to fix it, you might as well just kill yourself.
Great recommendation.
Great.
All right. Well, if everybody, yeah, cheerio, thank you. Yeah, if everybody would like to hop in the chat and say thank you to Susan, that would be really nice. I appreciate. Thank you very much, Susan, for getting on. I know it was a little bit of a challenge, but it was very
You didn't know I knew
informative.
that many swear words, did you?
I figured there was a lot more being said behind the Facebook Messenger. All right,
Yeah.
everybody's showering you with praise. Great job, Susan. Thank you. I will give you a thumbs up and a heart.
Oh, thank you. I just hope
So,
it was
so if there's no other questions, what we're going to do is I'm going to stop recording, but we'll continue the talk because we want to take care of some agenda items, the anthology and the write-in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop on the recording.